Good evening. On behalf of the Federated Department of History at Rutgers University-Newark and New Jersey Institute of Technology, and our partner for this event, Union County College, thank you for tuning into What I Still Don't Know, Exploring the Limits of Historical Evidence with Dr. Michelle Rotunda. Before we officially begin, a few very brief notes. This event is being recorded for our archive and will be made available on our YouTube channel. I will post the link in the chat and hope you will subscribe and follow our social media accounts to learn more about our faculty, courses, and events of interest. For the students in the room, that I know your professor is a wonderful ambassador for. I would be happy to answer any questions that you have about our undergraduate or our graduate program here at the Federated Department. Closed captioning is enabled, and to view, click on the closed caption CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to display your subtitles or to view a full transcript. Now, to ensure the comfort of everyone participating today, chat messages are only visible to speakers, but your questions and comments they will shape the conversation. So we're eager to receive them. So you can type any questions into the Q&A box, and you can put any comments into the chat, and we will answer as many live as time allows. So with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Michelle Rotunda. Before she became assistant professor of history at Union County College, she earned her master's from our Federated History Department and her PhD from Rutgers New Brunswick History. So our double alumna, we are so happy to have her back. An award-winning teacher, as her students will attest. Her courses in US history and government are always popular, and I can remember the waiting list being so incredibly long for them. The subject of tonight would be her book, A Drunkard's Defense, Alcohol, Murder, and Medical Jurisprudence in 19th Century America. It was published by the University of Massachusetts in February, and it's already receiving great praise. Scott Martin has written that it's a significant contribution, complementing other work on temperance and medical history, and addressing the important and neglected topic of alcohol, murder, and the law. Alan Rogers writes, Rotunda writes clearly and authoritatively about controversial legal rules that allowed links between alcoholism, insanity, and violent crime in this compelling narrative that pulls together vast literature. So we are in for a treat, and soon we'll hear more about why. So first, Dr. Rotunda is going to talk to us about her book for about 10 minutes. And during this time, think of any questions that you have and feel free to send them, because after that, she'll answer any questions that you have. So with that, thank you so much, Michelle, for joining us tonight. We look forward to learning more about this important work and your process for doing it. Virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Christina. It's really nice to be here, even though I'm not there. I actually, did teach at Rutgers Newark for a number of years. And, I just was so lucky to have just great students, both at Rutgers Newark and at Union County. So I'm glad we can do this event, that's student focused, and I can bring all of my great students together. Also, I do want to thank you for showing up to a talk that's basically called What I Don't Know. So don't say that you weren't warned about this if you don't learn anything. I'm going to start with the story, actually, and then I'm going to give you a little background on the book. In chapter 6, there is a man named James Graves. I'll come back to this first slide here. And James Graves is this, second man here. And he killed an 11-year-old boy, a neighbor, and was actually in Newark, New Jersey in 1881. Martin, the man on the left, was actually drunk. Graves was likely insane, and there was some comparison of their cases. The trial was covered extensively in the papers, and I first came across it because it was referenced by a well-known neurologist, Dr. Edward Spitzka, who had appeared in the trial of Charles Guiteau, who assassinated President Garfield. I went down to the New Jersey archives. I found the transcripts from the appeal. I went to the Newark Library, through the microfilm, through the newspapers. And several of these sources mention a journal that Graves had kept. And I mentioned this to some colleagues in history, and they're all like, oh, it's got to be somewhere. It was evidence. You got to find this journal. Would have loved to have had the journal, but would not keep evidence, from over 100 years ago. I wasn't too sure. So, rather than kind of call, the Newark police and ask them, I went to my husband who worked for the Bergen County prosecutor at the time and asked him to call because I figured, they would take his call, which he did. He's a good husband. And he actually called the Essex County prosecutor's office, and they basically are probably still laughing at him. They said, there's no way. They don't save that kind of evidence. There's just too much, especially since the case had been solved and Graves was executed. I would have loved to have had that journal. And it's just one example of things that might have existed or things that are, you don't get. And there's a lot that when you tell a story, you're really kind of tied to what evidence you can get your hands on. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, but assuming most people have not read the book, I'm going to give you a little background about the book, a little bit about my research, so you know what it's about. I'm happy to take any questions. I can talk about some of the cases in more detail if we do that. So I'll start with an overview. The cover that you see here is interesting because it was taken from part of this lithograph called A Drunkard's Progress that was meant to support the temperance movement. It kind of shows the consequences of drinking. So you kind of start with, a glass with a friend. And in this picture, we see that he ends up with death by suicide. For my book, we actually have murder cases. And so my book really focuses on the last part of this progress of the drunkard. And these were mostly men who were drunk. The 19th century, if you committed murder while you were intoxicated, there wasn't a lot you could argue. And so generally it was sort of the drunkard's defense. In a lot of these cases, perhaps not surprisingly, men killed their wives. And I just want to jump to, this was actually what I had suggested for the cover, but it was a bit too much to put on there. But again, the idea of a man who killed his wife was meant to be an important temperance lesson, that the alcohol had made him do it. So, assuming that the evidence was overwhelming, and usually it was, so many of these cases end with a man kind of basically bloodied, holding an axe, standing over the body of his wife. Somebody who read an early draft of the book asked me, why is the wound always 3 or 4 inches? Because it was always an axe in most cases. So you couldn't argue that you didn't do it. So you basically had 2 options at trial. You could either argue an insanity defense, or you could argue for a reduced charge. Both defenses are based on arguments related to intent and responsibility, basically that you didn't mean to do it. Now, these weren't options at the start of the 19th century. Legally and in society, drunkenness was not considered an excuse for crime. The idea was that if you drank, you made the choice to drink, you knew you were going to get drunk, and therefore you were fully responsible for anything that happened. They actually even had, since early on, exceptions in the law that if you were made intoxicated without your knowledge, if somebody had spiked your drink or done something like that, then you actually weren't responsible because you did not intend to get drunk. But there was also some recognition that individuals didn't always behave as they normally would when under the influence of alcohol. So the legal system had to kind of weigh this individual responsibility versus the interest of the good of society. But generally, it came down on the idea of the voluntary nature to drink in the early 19th century. But this gets a little bit more complicated over the course of the century. And there's 2 reasons. One was the growing use of the insanity defense, and the other was the introduction of degrees of murder into the legal system. And so these 2 things sort of became the drunkard's defense. The insanity defense itself was very contentious. It has a long history. But at the beginning of the century, drinking was only relevant to making a case of insanity if the habit led to what was known as settled insanity, meaning you actually became insane as a consequence of your heavy drinking and that you were insane whether you were drunk or not, that it was now a permanent condition. There's a lot of cases where they're kind of weighing this back and forth, especially some early cases. And here's another thing I don't know. In these cases where people claimed insanity, were they just drunk? Were they actually insane? You had sometimes physicians weigh on both sides. But the decision was tough then, and I don't really know the nature of the state of mind under which they were acting. I only know the arguments for one or the other. By the 1820s, there's a distinctive medical state, and this is sort of the first sort of broadening of the definition of insanity related to drinking. Delirium tremens, or what was also called mania a potu, was noted by medical experts. And the effects of delirium tremens were just thought to be terrible, from all sorts of physical symptoms to lurid hallucinations. These were famously highlighted by the Washingtonians, who was a group of habitual drunkards in the 1840s. And delirium tremens worked as a defense because it was a state of insanity that importantly began only when intoxication stopped. So unlike regular intoxication, you weren't under the influence of alcohol, and presumably you did not intend to get delirium tremens. Being drunk was foreseeable if you drank, but delirium tremens was not. The actually first significant case that was used as an important precedent was a ship's captain, Alexander Drew, in 1827, who, in wanting to stop drinking, threw all the alcohol overboard, presumably, and then killed his first mate a couple days later. So that was thought to be pretty clear. He couldn't have been drunk if he threw all the alcohol overboard. So this opens the door to greater consideration of drinking and insanity that eventually includes moral insanity. And there's sort of like a backlash that this is going too far by the end of the century. There also emerged the possibility of a sort of compromise verdict, one that weighed intent alongside criminal actions. And this is adding statutory degrees of murder into the law. From the end of the 18th century to the early 19th century, states started to revise their criminal codes to include degrees of crime. This change was influenced in part by a reaction against capital punishment, people who had opposed that. Pennsylvania was actually the first state to do this in 1794, and others followed over the next few decades. So with this change, intoxication then becomes a potentially mitigating factor, because it was a state of mind that rendered a person incapable of forming the requisite intent to commit first-degree murder. And murder in the first degree was characterized by very specific language, like willful or deliberate or premeditated. And it required a specific unlawful intent. So crimes that did not meet this definition were considered murder in the second degree under the law, and sometimes manslaughter. And I'll probably get to the story of a few of these individuals who did end up getting sort of manslaughter as their sentence. Intoxication then was potential evidence that a crime that requires specific formation of intent wasn't committed. Now, I find this fascinating, not just in sort of the mitigating factors towards murder committed while you're intoxicated, but as you start stretching the law, this allows for more discretion for the juries. And you see this sort of negotiation between, sometimes some sympathy for the defendant if they believe there wasn't an intent, and what's in the public interest. And there's a lot of trials throughout the book. And the trials kind of let you get at the voices of regular people, as they testify. I'm going to share, I think, some of those depending on how the conversation goes. I have a number of these trials to share with you, but I do want to kind of go to the discussion and maybe address some particular discussions, and I can go back and forth and discuss those as we move forward. So I'll take a short break, deal with some questions, and then I can talk about a few other cases.
So we already have a question.
Okay, good. See?
Which I completely appreciate, especially for those that are probably figuring this out now. But how did you come to this topic? And can you talk a little bit about how you located the sources?
Yep. So I initially was looking at this through the history of medicine. I was sort of interested in how physicians looked at a state of intoxication. I even tried to include, some other drugs at the time. I was trying to look at addiction and issues like that and sort of see the medical definition, which, if you think about it, we're still struggling with this today, how that was understood in the 19th century. But it was very difficult not to be distracted by, some of these murder cases. One of the first cases I actually found was in 1862. And this was I believe it was in the American Journal of Insanity. There was such a thing. And I remember it was not digitized at the time. So I was over in, the Rutgers library and, going through and just kind of looking for something that would sort of fit this theme. And there was a case of a man, William Hopp, in 1862 in Illinois, who, had killed his wife. She accused her of, plotting the deaths of literally like thousands of men. I mean, the man sounds like, there was definitely some mental illness there, although it's difficult to say. He said his wife had engaged in prostitution, and he had killed her and was now being tried for her murder. it was actually the characters that, well, I'll get to that. So what I had found was Andrew McFarland, who was the superintendent of the Illinois Insane Asylum, was arguing that William Hopp was insane, that despite the drinking, he thought he saw signs of insanity. But it's very difficult not to kind of start reading through some of the details of the trial. And, you start wondering about how drinking fit into society. So I start looking up, for beyond, just this medical journal, the newspapers and what's listed there. And then you find, all kinds of details. He had 13 children with his wife. These specific details, that he thought she was kind of making nooses up in the loft of where they lived. The daughter at one point tried to, jump in the way, but she ended up fleeing the scene because he was, waving the axe around. In the newspaper accounts, they bring up this accusation that the wife was a prostitute, but at the same time, they said, of course, this wasn't true. And I thought in sort of a backhand compliment, they said, oh, she was a woman with grown children. How could she even be accused of such a thing? They also reported that at one point she had applied for divorce, which is something, there weren't records on. And that's the part of the story that, I really wanted to get to. And if you kind of go back to this sort of progress of the drunkard, I'm at the end, and, what is in some ways the most exciting part in some ways. But often the story of the woman, reflected here in the center, it was hard to find a lot about the women. Sometimes it took a while to even find out, their first names, because it wasn't listed in a lot of the reporting. I don't know about, when she applied for divorce, why she didn't go through with it. Did she actually see a lawyer? It was just a passing comment in the newspaper. And so those are a lot of things I don't know that I really wanted to kind of get at through these stories, and get at what the sort of the community view. And I wanted to look at how both men and women and regular people thought of these crimes and this drinking that they saw around them.
Thank you for answering that. We have a few questions are now coming in together. So
Okay.
Thank you. Keep them coming. First, thank you for this talk, Professor. I was intrigued by the idea of limits of evidence, not just legal evidence, but also historical. It's something that historians often have to deal with. We all have those diaries, air quotes, and documents we wish we could get our hands on that are lost to time. American history in some way benefits from a robust archive and libraries, unlike other regional histories. I was wondering how you work around these gaps in history and evidence to build a robust narrative and thesis for your book, or even generally during your research. Excellent question.
I can't say I always have. There's a lot of cases, and I'll be, some of it's a little bit arbitrary in terms of which ones to choose. I usually took my cue from those that had gained some notoriety, as sort of a stand-in for something that was important or relevant, or something that people, maybe were talking about, around the proverbial water cooler. You'd see some of these cases would seem sort of local, but they would kind of be reported in these papers, around the country. So I often looked first at cases that were discussed by physicians, so that you could at least make sure that you had the medical interpretation. Cases that had appeals tended to be more interesting, and also the evidence was often saved. The appeals courts were a higher court, so it was much easier to kind of get your hands on evidence for those. But often that's all you had was the appeal. Just to show you, some of the evidence here. Next one, looked like this in some of the older cases. And, bless the archivist from Kentucky, who I think for about $10 copied this case and mailed it to me. But, you kind of have to go through this, and you could really, find some testimony in there. But often you were dealing with cases where the original case was lost. I tried as often as possible to be inclusive and note witnesses that were mentioned. And sometimes you could find out a little bit more about them or not. But if there was testimony that, then I could at least speak to what, ordinary people were saying. But, to be honest, as I said, some decisions were made by the fact that there was enough evidence there to talk about it. And that it did tend to be the cases that got a little more notoriety, that stand in that you use to really kind of build your point.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So now moving to the chat box, in case you're following along, Michelle.
Yes.
Were you able to note the type of alcohol being abused in each case? Did it matter to anyone? Was one seen as worse than another? Thank you for that question.
That's interesting because often they didn't really say. It was, the demon rum. It was, the 19th century, you had a growing temperance movement. And I'll give you an example of, here is a case of Terence Hamill. And I love the newspapers because, it's just really, you read this and like, you kind of want to know more, right? He's an employee of the United States Bonded Warehouse. He kicked his wife, Eliza, to death. If you read more on this, you'll notice he says that, not in this article, but I found out he had iron nailed shoes, which he kicked her to death with. And by the way, he received a lesser sentence because it was said that he did not intend to kill her. Otherwise, he would have used like a knife or a gun and not just kicked her with the shoes. So that was actually seen as a mitigating factor. But in his case, Hamill was interesting because he actually got a lot of sympathy. You could see here his friends paid, for a lawyer for him. They paid for the defense. His story was used as this classic temperance tale. So the type of alcohol wasn't as important. It was, that the demon rum had kind of made him do this. And he was characterized as being strictly temperate, they said, on most occasions, but he was, and I have some quotes here, he was made infuriated and ungovernable by drink, that he killed the wife of his youth and the mother of his children. So it was the alcohol that really shared part of the blame here. And the defense had to admit that he did kill her. He was found practically in the act of doing it. But the court charged that his judgment was obscure, that his intent was to beat his wife, not kill her, right? And it was only because he was under the influence of a drunken state that he would not have acted like this if he had been in a state of sobriety. And the jury actually ended up giving him manslaughter in the second degree, which is really a much lower sort of charge. And in reading the sentencing, the judge basically just showed this as sort of the classic temperance tale. He said that, the horrible death of the wife was really attributable to the use of intoxicating drinks, that everyone should sort of, look at his case and vow never to touch spirituous liquor again. There were references to that maddening poison in this trial. The guy only got 4.5 years, which seems, remarkably short period of time, given, again, really this horrific beating death of his wife. But it wasn't the particular alcohol. Again, it was that maddening poison, demon rum, intoxicating drink that was blamed in part and shared the responsibility.
Were those who pleaded insanity in court automatically submitted to a psychiatric clinic or asylum?
That is a good question. And generally, yes, in the cases, that they noted what happened to them. And this goes to another, I told you it was going to be all stuff I don't know. A lot of times I don't know what happened to the people afterwards. There was a case I know of William Choice, who, actually right during the Civil War had killed somebody. He did end up going to an insane asylum, but only temporarily, because when Civil War broke out, he was actually released and he became a sharpshooter for the Confederate Army. So I do know his case, that he went only temporarily. There are others that suggest they go there. I don't always know how long they were held. Those records aren't always there. There were some that, there was a case they would plead, for the children, and I don't know what happened to the children afterwards. Often the story ended with the sentencing, whether they were executed or whether they were found not guilty by reason of insanity. So it kind of depends on the time period and where they were.
That makes sense. So moving to the chat questions again.
Yes.
Out of all the cases you have researched, which one stands out the most for you?
Oh, good, because I do want to talk about this one particular case. Okay. I have a few cases here, and I figured, maybe they would come up then. There's actually a few I could talk about.
Okay.
All right, so this is a case, and I'll tell you why I like it so much, because there are women's voices in this one. I actually have a case of a woman murderer, too, we can get to if we have time. But This is one I actually found late because I had just come across a brief mention of it. There was nothing that really seemed, outstanding about it. It was in Connecticut, 1845. Orrin Woodford murdered his wife, Diana. And I was actually on the Yale site, and they have all these pamphlets. If you're interested in sort of murder pamphlets, they have them all up there. So I happened to look through this one a little bit. I hadn't seen any real, like medical testimony on it. But once you start reading these things, they're very difficult to put down, to be honest. So I'll give you a little background on this and tell you why I like it so much. So Diana Woodford was discovered in her bed with an extensive set of injuries. And I mean, it was just horrific. She had blows to her face. She had a fractured skull. Her cheek was depressed. They said, her stomach was protruding out because, he had killed her with the axe. And the axe was found there. And so the lawyer, not unlike probably lawyers today, was kind of trying to play both sides. He was arguing that his client, Orrin Woodford, was insane, but then he also kind of said, but he didn't intend to do it at the same time. And he was sort of saying both. And the medical experts were sort of fascinating. The most prominent one was a Dr. John Butler, and he was from the insane retreat at Hartford. There were a lot of these sort of, insane asylums with these very prominent superintendents who would write things. And his testimony was incredibly interesting in terms of what it said about the view of women. He said some weird things, like he didn't think Woodford was insane because Woodford said he was insane. And if you're really insane, you would never say you were insane. But then he also thought, but there was some evidence that perhaps he was, because he said evidence of insanity was that he was beating his wife to try to make her admit to being a prostitute. And no sane person would try to beat a confession out of their wives, which I didn't quite get his reasoning there. He also, we see here this almost direct challenge between sort of the medical interpretation and, the people, the women in the community speaking to him. Because at one point he was asked about the deceased wife, Diana, who had said previously that her husband abused her when he drank. And so somebody brought that up, saying, isn't he just a drunkard, that he abused her? And he said, I regard it as no weight. He said she was probably no very competent judge of such insanity, and not perhaps suspecting it herself, she would naturally attribute his conduct to some other cause. So he completely dismissed her. He was the expert, and the wife could not judge, that the husband was drunk. The great thing about this case, though, is, and this was included in the pamphlet, and this shows, here's the Woodford's house, and you see 3 other homes noted on here: Mrs. Hawley, Mrs. Walker, and Mrs. Woodruff. And these were neighbors that were friends with Diana. And they all were at the scene shortly after her body was discovered, and they all kind of went after him at trial. I love these women. I really want to go back in time and sit down and have coffee with them, because they were there at the trial and they shared their interpretation of this marriage. Nancy Hawley at one point just said, they asked, do you think he was crazy? And he goes, no, he always looked like that when he abused her. He always drank and, beat her up, basically. Sarah Walker said she confronted him because, of course, he was hanging around after, he killed his wife, and said, how long is it since you told me you would not abuse her again? What have you done? Directly to his face. And then you had Hannah Woodruff, where, also went up to Woodford and said, you basically stop acting like you're crazy. You're not crazy. And he said, if you are cider and rum has made you crazy, you're just drunk. And so these women really provided powerful testimony, at least, to my modern eyes, that this was a man who repeatedly drank, beat his wife, and then eventually killed her. But their condemnation didn't really resonate. In the end, he was found guilty of manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 10 years and fined $50 for this, again, brutal killing of his wife. But just having those women in there give their interpretation of this case, I thought was really important, because those are voices you don't often hear. So that was kind of one of my favorites.
So we're going to switch a little bit more to writing. Can you talk about what was the writing process like for you?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm actually writing an article with someone else, and we have completely opposite writing styles. I tend to write little bits of things kind of to fit in. And then, so I would have lots of cases, and I would sort of, list the cases. And then as I was kind of putting together my main point, I would add to them, and I would go back to the newspaper accounts, and, I would add the detail that I thought was relevant, and add the context. as I said, some of this was a little, haphazard as I came across the cases. So pretty much any case that involved sort of, drunkenness and murder. As I said, most of them were wives, but they weren't all. I did have a one woman murderer in there who was drunk. She actually ended up, she was convicted of infanticide. She killed her baby. And I would kind of put them, sort of in chronological, thematic order, and then start adding, the context to that to tell the story. In some cases became much more significant to the book. And then other cases, some kind of went away, some, were smaller, were kind of side notes. I don't know if that answers kind of what you were getting at.
I think so. I didn't see a follow-up question from them.
Follow up if you want, I'll come back to you.
Yes, if they have anything else to answer, just please put that in the chat. But let's stay on the writing side for a moment. Writers occasionally say something along the lines of a novel is never complete, just abandoned. How do you know when to abandon lines of inquiry, to stop looking for that elusive source, etc.? So that would be an important question for a lot of our folks that are writing right now.
Yeah, and that's a perfect saying. It is. At some point, you have to decide you end. And, to be honest, there were two things. One, I felt like I made a case of the changes over the 19th century, that I was able to kind of illustrate, where we were at the beginning of the century, talk about delirium tremens, extending insanity, the significance of the temperance movement, the significance of changing charges in murder, the sort of backlash that'll be there of moral insanity, and then kind of, ended it with this comparison of the two cases. The last chapter deals with these two, where we have the one person who was intoxicated, Martin on the left, and Graves, who likely was insane, and they both were executed. There was really no tolerance for this defense by the end of the century. But yeah, to be fair, you abandon it also partly because of deadlines. At some point, you decide you have enough, you get feedback, you try to address the feedback. I don't know how familiar people are with sort of, the writing process, the publishing process. I talked to the editor at the University of Massachusetts. They were interested. You kind of send them, an overview, then you send them a chapter. And ultimately you decide you have enough that you get some anonymous reviews. They send you back comments. You try to fix it up, you send it to other people, but at a certain point, they're like, well, we need your, final draft at this point, and then we need your edits at this point. And, I'll be honest, until the last edit, I actually added in one extra little case that I thought, clarified something. But at some point, you have to feel comfortable enough that you said something meaningful, even if you could always add more. And there's the practical real world process of, if you want to get something published, there's going to be a deadline, and you want to try to adhere to that as much as possible. Well,
that was definitely key.
yeah. It's a good thing there's a deadline.
Their deadlines are removable if you want it out. Yep. A comment, which is lovely. History Club says hello.
Hi, History Club. There's a lot of officers here, I saw.
Oh, well, thank you to Union College History Club for joining us this evening. We appreciate that. We do have another question, and I think we may also have time for one or two questions after this one. Michelle, yes? No?
Yes.
Okay. So the next one, did you encounter cases in this period intersecting with race?
Oh, yeah, that is a tricky question. Mm-hmm. It's one I actually struggled with a lot. All of my major cases are white people. As I said, there is one significant case of a woman who committed infanticide while she was drunk. And, you can do that, but you need to ask why you're doing that. And part of the reason is that the temperance narrative, this idea that, that the demon rum was sort of, corrupting, like the head of household and was bad for family, very much was more of a sort of, middle class narrative. It came out of the reform movement. And so the people who were best able to take advantage of the drunkard's defense were people who would have been viewed with sympathy for being drunk. So as far as race, and the question is, you kind of, throw in, there weren't a lot of cases that I came across. I do address one in the introduction, which is just really one that really makes that point of sort of this, racist nature of this sympathetic view of the alcoholic murderer. And this was an 1850 case. It was called the Mannheim tragedy. There's a pamphlet out there if you want to read it, where 2 Black men actually murdered 2 white women, which is important there. And it was funny, it was sort of talked about, they said, oh, the crime was the work of rum. So they did kind of show the evils of alcohol with that. But at the trial, neither man was portrayed sort of, sympathetically. The one lawyer did make a sort of half-hearted argument that he was drunk and couldn't form intent. And he was actually booed by the court that were there. And he basically said, I have to perform my sworn duty. I'm a lawyer, I have to do this. And he sort of defended his defense because he was, defending this murderer. And you can really see that the same kind of sympathy was not accorded these men. There's another case that I also do touch on, which shows another side of this. In the same, actually, it was in 1880. These 2 men here on the screen, Martin and Graves, both committed their murders in 1881. And in 1880, also in Newark, there was a man named Edward Kissam who was drunk and killed his wife. And he was identified in the papers as a Negro waiter. But his wife was also, she was a Black woman, and she was accused also of being drunk at the time that they both were out drinking. And he actually got murder in the 2nd degree. So we can kind of, juxtapose those a little bit. I, would like to say more about that. The one case you have, Black man who killed white women, and the other it was a Black man who killed his wife. Very different kind of reaction. But I'm hesitant to make too much of a conclusion because there just weren't a lot of cases that were covered extensively in the same way that a lot of the cases of these, white men who killed their wives and blame it on demon rum were covered.
Thank you for that. So I think we might have time for 1 or 2 more. I hope I didn't miss any. I monitor the chat and the Q&A, but if anyone has any other comments or questions for Dr. Rotunda, please feel free to ask them. It was a very lively group, so I appreciate that. History Club definitely represented.
Thank you, History Club.
But while we wait to see if here we do. Okay.
Okay. Oh, you want to hear about the female killer? All right.
Yes.
Tease that one just in case. All right. Let me go to, let's see. So I think this is interesting because this has a lot about evidence too. So her name was Anne Barry. And I think she only got some attention because there was a debate over moral insanity at the time. There's a very prominent psychologist, Dr. John Gray, who thought moral insanity was ridiculous, that it was kind of excusing crime, and they had tried to use that as a defense for Anne Barry, and so he kind of got all in an uproar about it and ended up, testifying at this trial, which is something he normally wouldn't have been involved in, which is why we know a little bit more about it. And I did want to include more women drunkards, but just a woman being drunk already was, a strike against her. There were even some defenses of men where they said, drinking shows that a man is being, sociable, and it's to be expected at times. But for women, it was much different. Now, if you look at this article I have here, the shocking case of infanticide, the interesting thing is initially in this article, if you read down a little bit, it says they sent out men to search for the wicked mother who'd been guilty of this crime. And it says it's suspected that the name of the author of this crime is Cotter, right? Well, it wasn't. They were completely wrong. And I wish I knew more about this Cotter family because it says Cotter and crime are on synonymous terms, right? We never knew a man or woman by the name that was not a thief or a prostitute. Well, apparently Cotter was not the person who committed infanticide. So they eventually find Anne Barry. And her story, I think, is kind of sympathetic. She had been in jail for petty larceny. She actually stole clothes from a wash line, although there were some references that she had been arrested for drunkenness and disorderly conduct before. Women there was one study of women drinking, I think in New York City, that said about 40% of the people in jail for drunkenness were women. So, women did drink, but they, kind of weren't accorded the same sense of idea that this was, sort of a more normal thing to do that men had. And it doesn't easily fit into these narratives of temperance. And during the trial, all sorts of, I mean, first of all, it was a problem because it was infanticide. She had been in jail for 6 months. She was pregnant when she went to jail, and her baby daughter was only 5 weeks old when she left. And it sounds like it was some kind of, desperation, at least according to sort of what she said, that she ends up drowning her child. She was accused of being a bigamist because her first husband, it wasn't clear that he had died and she married somebody else. In the trial, it was also brought up that she kissed another woman at one point. So they kind of threw everything at her. And her drinking didn't really provide the same kind of defense that it did to the men, but rather it was meant to be a sign of this moral insanity that she suffered. The interesting thing is, though, she was found guilty, but they didn't sentence her to execution because they didn't want to execute a woman. And I actually do see in the chat, could have been postpartum depression. I mean, that's another thing. It's very hard to diagnose people in retrospect, but yeah, the baby was 5 weeks old, had been delivered in jail. She was, just released. I think it was, that day or the day before when she killed the child. So, it's hard to say what was going on there. Certainly, that's not something that would have been raised because the idea was that, women were supposed to have these motherly, nurturing feelings. So she was much more of an aberrant actor than a man would be who had committed murder. And you can compare her to, again, going back to this case, where are we? Robert Martin here killed not just his wife, but I think she was 2 years old, his daughter, 18 months. I think she was 18-month-old daughter. And he was like, well, he didn't mean to kill the child. She was his favorite. And everybody, brought that up about how he didn't mean to kill the child. And so we see this really interesting, women were supposed to be, protecting, and the fact that she killed her child, there was no understanding of postpartum depression. That was another sort of, almost nail in her coffin there. Thank you for asking about that.
Yeah, excellent questions. I want to make sure that we focus on any of the other students or history club folks that have any questions that were not answered. Let's see, we're looking at that. No, I think you covered everything, which is, yeah, well done. Thank you so much. Thank you. For sharing more about this work. There are a few things that I wanted to point out for those of you that are obviously interested in history and are not already members or following the Newark History Society. I'm going to put that link in the chat. Oh, hold on a second.
Oh, there is a question.
Yes, there is in the chat. You mentioned neurology. From that perspective, what insights did you gain during your research that would implicate or support the claim of insanity or support drunkenness from the perspective of the law? Question.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting you mentioned neurology because that's a specific specialization that came out kind of later in the century. And a lot of the neurologists who were, much more sort of, professionalized than, the older kinds of physicians, they definitely saw themselves as kind of like at a higher level than a lot of the superintendents of the insane asylums. They were looking to kind of distance themselves a little bit from the way that drunkenness and moral insanity had overlapped. So in that particular case, even though, you had Robert Martin, who killed his wife and child when he was drunk, and you have James Graves, who basically, shoots and kills an 11-year-old neighbor boy. You have the neurologist Spitzka kind of looking to find medical evidence for the insanity of Graves, but very dismissive of Robert Martin, who was getting more sympathy, this sort of family man who was out drinking and killed his wife and child. There's actually a petition for Robert Martin in the community looking to commute his sentence. They didn't want him executed, and they were pleased to the governor to at least give him life in jail rather than execute him and think of the other children that he has. Whereas James Graves was really just sort of, excoriated in the press, but it was the, neurologist and this emerging more, professional kind of class of medical men that were sort of defending what they saw as true insanity versus the kind of, moral insanity that was associated with too much drinking.
Oh, lovely comments. Well, thank you so much for joining us. So the comment we're responding to is thank you so much. This was such a fun and interesting event. Lovely to have you all join us today. As always, you could see why Professor Rotunda was always popular with students. Very thoughtful answers to the questions. And what I was starting to say before was about the Newark History Society, because she will be in conversation with George Robb and Laura Triano, who's in our honors college here and historian here at Rutgers University-Newark. They'll be speaking about the noble experiment in Newark, temperance, prohibition, and bootlegging. So if you're interested in checking out that event, I'm going to add that to the chat. I'm also going to plug that we have many events coming up over these next couple of weeks, including Surviving the Winters, New Directions in Military History with Dr. Stephen Elliott. We have Teaching Empire with Dr. Elizabeth Etrium. And we have special readings by contributors to Divine Feminist, and that's an anthology of women and non-binary folks. Last but not least, we're also sponsoring Ancestors at Play, Audacity and Visibility in the Queer Black Archive. So in the chat, there's going to be much information there, so feel free to save it. There are links to each one, and if you follow us on social media at Federated History, and our website is history.newark.rutgers.edu. You'll be able to see all of our upcoming events and spotlights on our faculty and special campaigns and news. Again, I want to just thank you so much for coming back and agreeing to a book talk with us first. You're coming home. We're so glad to have had you and have this conversation. And last but not least, because I know that as an ambassador of our federated program, I just want to reiterate for those of you that are considering transferring to Rutgers University-Newark, it is a fantastic place to study. Our faculty are extremely well known and respected in their fields, but they're also just wonderful human beings who are very committed to your success. So if you are interested in joining us, please drop your email address and I will get in touch with you very quickly. Also, for those of you who are graduating this year, special shout out. Now we have some seniors on the call. We also have a graduate program here at the Federated Department of History. We offer 2 degrees, the MA and the Master of Arts for teachers. So if you're not sure that research is the way you'd want to go, but you want to teach and engage in that way, we're here for you as well. So please follow us again, join our website. And if you haven't already, buy our book. The press is offering a 30% discount. I am all about the discounts, and I'm going to put that in the chat one more time, just in case you'd like to pick up your own copy. And with that, I think, there's some more. Oh, thank you. So you see you have you have some fans also in the chat. Thank you all so very much for joining us this evening. And great. Okay, wonderful. I will get in touch with you, Steph. And if anyone else has any questions, feel free to hang around. We'll be happy to answer them more individually if you'd like. And if you feel comfortable afterward, we can turn on our camera so it feels more like an actual conversation to switch from webinar mode. So again, stay safe, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I hope to see you at our future events coming up this month. And in the fall, we should be offering some things in person, and I hope to literally see you then. And with that,